My name is Kay Danes, and I'm appearing as a human rights advocate and survivor of arbitrary detainment.
Thank you, Dr Danes. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you very much. After 2 decades of advocacy in this space, it's really quite gratifying to see conversations finally progress where to the point where the Australian government may finally be willing to officially recognise Australians like myself who were wrongfully and arbitrarily detained overseas, and not simply pass off those.
I think we've lost you, Dr Danes.
Connection's dropped out or something.
The committee will just suspend for a couple of minutes and we'll try and reform the connection with Dr Danes. Thank you. And Dr Danes, you had just started your opening statement. If you could perhaps start again, that would be great.
Oh, okay. No problem. Ready to go?
Yes. Thank you.
I think the line's pretty choppy.
Oh, no.
Maybe it just needs to turn...
We'll just suspend.
Okay, my apologies. I don't know how I lost the connection. Should I join from my phone, perhaps?
Is there a way to dial in on tele?
Yep, we might suspend again, and Dr Danes, the Secretariat, will sort you out to call in.
Thank you. After 2 decades...
Oh, no.
No, it's too much in bandwidth.
Nope. Okay. Suspend again.
Of advocacy, it's personally great. Sorry.
Sorry, Dr Danes. I think it's too much for the connection. We'll suspend again and we'll get you to phone into the hearing if that's all right.
That's fine.
Thank you. Sorry about this. All good. The committee will suspend for another couple of minutes. With your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to open by saying that I'm very pleased and honoured to be attending this hearing committee, Senate committee hearing rather. And I'm very grateful to the fact that the Australian government may be finally willing to officially recognise Australians like myself and others who are wrongly and arbitrarily detained overseas. I can personally attest to the fact that arbitrary detainment is terrifying, and I would urge you to imagine for a moment that you are working overseas when government forces suddenly come into the street, into your office, drag you out onto the street, throw you into a car, drive you to a secret location where you are held indefinitely in a tiny cell without adequate food, water or medical care. You're cut off from the rest of the world, you're cut off from anyone that can help you. You're subjected to torture in an attempt to force a false statement to an invented crime, and you are stripped of your dignity and rights. You struggle every day to survive inhumane conditions. This happened to me, and it can certainly happen to you. Because of this ordeal, I am no longer eligible, along with other people like me, to travel under the Australian Visa Waiver Program. This despite my more recent employment where I had travelled on a diplomatic passport, having met the criteria for the most stringent government security vetting protocols, both foreign and domestic. Instead, I'm forced to live with a label of moral turpitude, which is considered to be conduct contrary to community standards of honesty, good morals or justice. And the label persists today, despite the fact that my dedication to international humanitarian service, social justice and human rights is recognised by the Australian government and international organisations. And that I'm also the recipient of both the Medal of the Order of Australia, Rotary International Awards, Australia Day Honours and Awards, and other notable awards for my service to humanity. None of these accolades or security clearances can spare me the indignity of what I must face whenever I seek to travel overseas as a common tourist. I therefore appeal for your compassion to advocate for those of us who have faced such injustice that even with the offering of a presidential pardon, that was the case in our case, there is no relief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daines. Sorry, I'm just negotiating with the Deputy Chair who's going to ask questions first, but I will go first. And I know the Deputy Chair does have some questions as well. Dr. Daines, you spoke in, I guess, hypothetical terms about what an experience of an Australian detained overseas could be like, but I was hoping you could briefly outline for the committee how you were detained and your experience as someone who's been unlawfully detained.
Absolutely. I was basically, my husband and I at the time were working in a foreign country, in Laos in particular, providing security services to the foreign investment community there, including the embassies. And the secret police came and abducted my husband from his office with no arrest warrant or any opportunity for him to call the embassy. They just simply took him to an undisclosed location. And I discovered this and I immediately alerted the Australian Embassy. At the time, I was on my way home. The Australian Embassy said that they would go and try and make representations to seek out where my husband had been taken to. We had a rough idea where he'd been taken. They couldn't find him, so they then came to the border to escort me and my two children out of the country. The secret police detained me at the border and I was separated from my children. The Australian consular official took carriage of my two children and arranged for their evacuation back to Australia. And once that occurred, I was taken to an undisclosed location where I was subsequently, along with my husband in separate conditions, detained for almost a year. So that was basically the outline. There was no arrest warrants. There were no process or procedures or due process followed, as you would expect in a detainment, in an arrest. We were simply abducted. So you were never charged with anything? No. We were taken in and put into a secret prison camp. At the time was a home to 100 prisoners, of which 58 were political prisoners. And it was very, very difficult to get any communication out or in over the next couple of months. Yeah, I'll get to the communication point in a moment, but how old were your kids when they were evacuated? So my son was 7 years old, and my daughter was 10. Oh, my God. And the government, the DFAT organised their flights home to Australia as unaccompanied minors, and they returned home to my parents who lived in Brisbane and to their sister who was actually continuing her studies in Australia. So it was very, very traumatic for the children to be subjected to that sort of detainment. There were 30 secret police that surrounded our car at the time. They had their guns out. I mean, it was completely distressing. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. That and for you as parents as well, to be separated from your children. Obviously, it was wonderful that your children were able to be safely evacuated to Australia, but to go through that process of separation must have likewise been terrible. Indeed, and I have to say that, we're talking 23 December 2000, so the day they flew home to Australia was for Christmas Day, my mother's birthday, and of course the birth of Christ. So, and Christmas celebrations. So it was very traumatising. My husband had been in the Defence Force and was still serving at that time. He was working in Laos with approval from the Defence Chief, and but he had been 20 years in the military. So he had gone away on numerous deployments, but the children had never lost both parents at the one time, and then not to see them again for almost a year. It was very, very disturbing.
At what point did the Australian government recognise that you had been unlawfully detained?
So we provided security to the Australian Embassy. So the Embassy actually recognised our status long before the Australian government, and it was thankful to the Ambassador, Jonathan Thwaites, and senior consular officers like Robin Hamilton-Coates and Louise Waugh and others that made very early representations, practically on the onset, that this was not a typical case. They alerted the then Foreign Minister, Mr. Alexander Downer, and the then Prime Minister, Mr. John Howard, and it wasn't actually, though, until my parents went to the media that things started to really take off, and the government was more encouraged at the time to say, well, okay, we need to deal with this as a complex case. They referred to it as a private matter to the public, but to us, they actually confirmed to us that they believed that we were being held hostage.
That's interesting. So 25 years ago, I was not reading the paper religiously. I must apologise. But
Me neither.
but the reporting at the time, was all of that public commentary basically saying that this was not a case of you and your husband being taken hostage? This was just you'd be detained in overseas for seemingly no reason?
Well, it was the people that were detaining us were actually quite clever. They were secret police. They had an agenda. They were trying to seize control of a lot of the foreign investment projects at the time. So they fed a story to the media, who were quite willing to run the story without having access to us or to anyone else for that matter. And so the secret police detaining us fed a story to the media that we were gem smugglers, which was just an incredible story. But the media picked it up, and that was the narrative that ensued, and to the destruction of our reputations. And so when my family was subjected to that allegation, your adult children have been accused of smuggling sapphires and gems, what do you say to that? They landed on my father's doorstep, 200 journalists on the front door of my father's property saying, can you answer, can you do a please explain? And, so it was very difficult to get the actual narrative out, the actual details of the case, because once the media got hold of it, you couldn't undo the damage that was done. So that is a big piece of it. Eventually, however, the team that we engaged or were engaged on our behalf started to trickle feed information out. My father in particular did a great job of just coming out the front and giving the media, weekly updates as he could, so that they could begin to understand that, hang on a minute, this is not a criminal case, despite what the detaining authority has put to the Australian public, because in this particular case, there were all the criteria of arbitrary and wrongful detention, which activated a whole of government approach, albeit behind the scenes, which activated special envoys engaging, and even the highest levels, the Governor-General engaging. So, but I've listened to some of the commentary of some of the other witnesses and the questions concerning should we go to the media. In some cases it's necessary, but it can be quite a bit of lion tamer trying to keep the wild animals in the cage.
So to be very clear, it was the Australian media that accepted the story that was being put out by the police in Laos that you were a gem smuggler. Like that was the story that was being promoted locally here in Australia.
Yes.
And I mean, it was 25 years ago, so it's perhaps difficult to go back in the time machine and imagine exactly what was happening around that time. But if that were to happen in this day and age, I assume some good, hard-working journalists would call up the Department of Foreign Affairs and ask them whether the government had any view on a situation such as yours. Do you know if that happened? If that happened at all when you were put under, I won't say arrest because you weren't charged with anything, but when you were locked up?
Yeah, the media, I know the ABC in particular went to the government and said, do you have a response? And it is documented in the public domain. And they would issue a generic response that we're aware that the Danes have been detained in Laos and we're not aware of the reasons for that detainment, but we are working to offer consular assistance to the Danes. And so it was a rather benign sort of response. And the ambassador would meet with us separately because my husband and I were not allowed to be together in any capacity for several months, about 6 months in fact. And we would hear snippets on the news. There was a way to hear what was going on, and we would hear snippets on the news that was talking about us and a lot of the political prisoners would say, why doesn't your government stand up and say publicly what it is? You're being held hostage. And I had to explain that that's not the way our government works. They're all about diplomacy because Laos enjoys a 50-year bilateral trade agreement with Australia, and that's the priority here. So, it was... Yeah, it's very political. It's at the onset of all these cases and all these cases since that time. I know that DFAT and the government have learnt a lot about ways of dealing with families, ways of dealing with prisoners, detainees, but it's still not enough because the damage that is done in those early instances of detainment, it requires an immediate analysis. It requires an immediate determination of whether you are wrongfully detained or whether you are a typical criminal civil case.
So in terms of your family back at home, you mentioned that I think it was your father went to the front door and there was a swarm of journalists outside asking him questions about your situation. Before that, did the government at the time make any contact with your family to alert them as to what had happened to you and provide any support locally? Or at that point in time when the media were swarming your parents' property, was that the first they basically became aware of it beyond having spoken to you?
The government did contact my parents to let them know that we had been detained overseas and that they were providing support and in the process of providing support to us. And they assigned, I believe they assigned 2 case officers to my family, to my parents who were looking after our children. These were 2 very senior diplomats that they had brought out of retirement that were very experienced in this sort of thing. And so that was the initial contact that my parents had. But at times I learned that my parents had experiences of extreme frustration in those days of not being able to get much communication back from the government. And to be fair to the government, there wasn't a great deal of communication that could be sought because we were detained and not offered regular consular access. So the early days were very difficult to establish that communication. But certainly, objectively, there was a strong willingness once my father's federal member of parliament, Mr. Con Shaka, advised my father to go to the media, and that would get the government moving a bit more diligently. And indeed it did.
Dr. Daines, I'm just going to pass the call quickly to Senator Ciccone. I do have more questions for you, but I know he has to run in a tick, so I'm just going to let him ask a couple.
That's right. And thanks a lot, Chair. And hello, Dr. Daines. And, you know, I was about to say if you'd been in contact with your local member, but Con Shaka, someone who's no longer in this place anymore, but I was wondering also whether you had any engagement, or your family had any engagement with then the Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, or other members of the Howard government, considering this been around 25 years ago now since you went through the ordeal?
Senator, it's such an honour to speak with you, and I appreciate your time is precious. Mr. Downer actually flew to the little town of Birkdale in Brisbane where my parents lived at the time, and he wanted to personally come to their home. He brought a lovely encyclopedia, a world map to give to the children, and they thought that was quite funny because they said, doesn't the Foreign Minister know where Laos is? It was a bit of an icebreaker, but all jokes aside, he did make the effort to go to my parents' house and to reassure them personally that he and Prime Minister Howard and other senior diplomats were working diligently on the case.
Yeah.
And for that, I'll be eternally grateful.
And look, certainly a lot has changed probably on how we handle these matters, it's fair to say, but I was just interested back then, like what support did you or your family received after your detention? And was this, how is this best facilitated between the family and the support from government?
There wasn't a whole lot of support following. It's kind of like we came home, you're home now, get on with your life.
Yeah.
And that was how it was back in the day. That came with a lot of implications because I wanted to return to work in the security sector. I now have a criminal conviction. And according to Queensland legislation, you cannot hold a security licence if you have a criminal conviction. And so I had to go back to Mr. Downer and ask him if he could write me a letter that would suffice the appropriate department for issuing the licence, which he did. But I feel that it just it was only a band-aid, Senator. The real detriment came later when I attempted to travel as a tourist overseas, as I said in my opening statement, is that I no longer qualify for the visa waiver program. So every time I travel, and I believe Peter Gresti has also made this remark, is that we're required to disclose that we were taken through the judicial process of that country and given a conviction in order for that country, that state, to save face. And then we were diplomatically processed out via presidential pardon. But to this day, it causes me problems, and it's going to cause me problems again, and many Australians problems again in 2025, when the UK and Europe and other countries sign up to this this new process where you have to declare your convictions. It's maddening. And a recent example is when I went to the United States, I sought a tourist visa and I was denied, even though I'd previously travelled to testify at US congressional forums in 2002 and 2009. I had to call on about 7 senior high officials in the Australian government, including the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, Barnaby Joyce, Minister Penny Wong, my local federal member Henry Pike, Mr Simon Birmingham was tremendous, former Ambassador Douglas Hartwick, former consular staff that were involved in our case, and a lovely woman, Tricia Martino, from the Director of Consular Operations Branch, to make representations on my behalf to the US consulate to say, hey, we don't believe she's a criminal, give her a visa. You know, it's so frustrating to be subjected to that and to be told that you are not an upstanding person to qualify for the visa waiver program.
Yes, and it's probably something that will be part of our report, I guess, once we finalise. And I guess, look, I know in the last couple of years the current government's established an external advisors group to hopefully improve and inform how we can best manage these cases going forward. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work that the current government has done in terms of trying to change the way that maybe DFAT and others engage with these issues, but I think it's fair to say that many people have learnt from past experiences, including yours, and in all these cases, when you're dealing with other foreign countries, there's got to be a level of sensitivity, but also acknowledging that we can also improve our internal structures. So, look, I just want to say thank you for the time that you've been able to share with us today. But I also just wanted to to ask a couple of those questions from earlier on and make sure that, you and your family, I know it's been around 24 odd years ago, but I'm sure still has an impact on your life and your children.
It does, Senator, and I very much appreciate your acknowledgement of that. That means a lot to me, and I know my parents are watching online, and it will mean a great deal to them. It was 2 decades ago, but I can tell you it's just like yesterday on some days. And I really would love to give all the support I can to our government in moving forward. There's a few models that are available. Prisoners Abroad UK is an excellent model for bridging the connection between government and families and those wrongly detained, and in fact those who are rightfully detained. They offer some great information, local networks in the country where the person might be detained. They offer care and aftercare. I believe this model could work. I did attempt to get this similar model through DFAT a few years ago when I was with Foreign Prisoner Support Service, because I've worked on over 1,000 cases of detainment, rightful and wrongful, but I think that's still an area that's quite weak, and I hope that the engagement continues. The Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance is an organisation that I'm proud to be associated with, and I'm sure that Kylie Gilbert-Moore and the team would like to discuss and work more collaboratively with the Department of Foreign Affairs to move those conversations along.
And I think we'll certainly be hearing from AWADA at some point during the inquiry, Dr. Daines. It's Senator Chandler back asking questions now. So you referenced in your remarks earlier that the Australian government didn't clearly have a view on the fact that you had been arbitrarily detained when it first occurred. At any point in that 12-odd months that you were detained, did they change that recognition?
Yes.
At what point did that occur?
Well, again, the embassy team on the ground believed right from the onset that we were arbitrarily detained. But if I can refer to, and not disrespectfully, the Canberra bubble, it took a little bit of encouragement from the ambassador to penetrate somewhat and get everybody on the right page and to understand what the story was. Respectfully, it wasn't that easy, Senator, to get information out of a closed country like Laos. At the time, it had only just opened up to foreign investors, and since 1997, we were detained in 2000. So that line of communication was difficult. We were one of the first cases, aside from Steve Pratt, if you might recall. He was coming back home to Australia at the time that we were detained, arbitrarily detained. And so there were a lot of lessons to be learned on how to respond to Australians in that situation. And to be honest, and even the consular staff have admitted this to me, they didn't have a lot of case examples to go by. So we were all in it together, we were all learning, and I agree that there were lessons to be learnt, and they have benefited a lot of Australians since, but there is still a lot of lessons that can be further implemented.
You referenced that the consular staff on the ground in Laos very quickly recognised that you and your husband were not a typical case. Do you have any view on how they made that assessment? How did they come to that position so quickly?
Well, they saw that my husband had been taken, had been kidnapped, had been taken to an undisclosed location. So they were not able to, that when they approached the Lao authorities where he had been last sighted, and when they had questioned the Lao police that were holding me, the secret police, they knew that there were no arrest warrants. There was no information forthcoming. There was no detail of where is my husband, where is Kerry Daines, where are you taking Kay? There's all these very simple signposts that have more legal names, but if we keep it simple, the signposting was there at the onset that they weren't following their own laws, let alone international law, on the process of detainment and arrest.
And I guess that's a difference between your case and some other wrongful detention cases that we see in more recent times, where in your instance there were no charges laid. The authorities literally just took you off the street, whereas these days we see a lot more instances where citizens overseas are subjected to a completely non-transparent legal process. They're arrested under trumped-up charges. Those charges are never really proven. So I guess from your perspective, if this might be hypothetical, but if you had been charged, say, when they took you in Laos, how much more difficult do you think it would have been for the local Australian consular staff on the ground to make that assessment that your case was out of the ordinary?
I think it would have been extremely difficult, and it does happen, as you say, and I think that's where it then would be referred to as maybe a complex consular case, and then you would be accorded the standard, these are your rights according to the consular charter. And in that instance, while in the time between that it takes them to figure out that actually the government is being deceived, you may have been subjected to torture, ill treatment, all manner of risk, in order to get to a judicial process. And as you say, that, you know, have they applied procedural fairness? Have you been given a right to a lawyer? You know, all these things. In our case, Senator, is that we were taken through the judicial process because after 6 months of us resisting torture and interrogation, it was quite evident to the Lao government that we would not sign any false statements under any circumstances. And the torture was real and it was brutal, but we resisted that. And so the only option then, as encouraged by the Australian Foreign Minister, was to find a diplomatic solution. And that meant that we would be subjected to a judicial process. The officer, the public prosecutor, and the people that were torturing us came into the prison and for the first time sat Kerry and I in a room together. This was 6 months after our arbitrary detainment, and told us that we would be going to court in 2 weeks and that we had already been found guilty and not to worry about what the charges would be because they would figure it out and tell us at the court. And it was a closed court. The embassy were not invited. They had kept a close eye on the court and they'd kept a close eye on movements in the Lao government. So they found out about the court case and they did turn up, and that was great. The ambassador got a front row seat, and the look on his face as the proceedings were underway was quite shocking. He was horrified, and the lawyer in him wanted to stand up several times and object, but there were no adversarial proceedings. We were merely told that we would be convicted of a crime. We would have an international conviction that would remain with us until such time as it wouldn't, and that was that. So, you know, to answer your question, I hope I've done it effectively, and to say that these things are not black and white, they're very grey, and hence why I believe, as others do, we need to have a designated task force. We need to have someone in each of the embassies that can be designated to follow up and investigate the distinction between the cases, to make sure that those that are innocent, as our government told us they believe that Kerry and I were innocent, that we can get that extra assistance that we need because the circumstances may be, and as was the case for us, we were subject to torture.
And I suspect I know the answer to this question, Dr. Daines, but is it important to that end for Australia to have a framework that clearly defines what wrongful detention and hostage diplomacy looks like, so that bad faith foreign actors are, for a start, deterred from engaging in the practice to start with, but know that the government will clearly define these cases, will clearly identify these cases where they fit within that definition, and will accordingly engage with whatever foreign country has unlawfully detained an Australian in order to facilitate their freedom and return to our country?
Absolutely, and I'll say that engagement must be done immediately, or almost immediately, and when we say immediate in these terms, you would expect within the first few weeks of detainment. When you're in that situation, you would hope within the first few hours, but realistically, that the government engage very quickly at the onset and at the highest level, because what usually happens in a lot of these cases is that it's not the government, it's the people in certain departments, the public officials that are doing this. In our case, it wasn't the government of Laos detaining us, it was the department officials in the Ministry of Interior, in the secret police, that were all involved in corruption, and so they were flying under the radar of the government. And then it wasn't until the Laos government actually learned what they were doing, that it brought embarrassment on the Laos government, and then it became a nightmare, a headache for the Laos government. So initially you have to have the government engaged. The Australian government must engage in these cases very early. They must have that distinction of what is a wrongful detainment, what is an arbitrary detainment. They really do need to get that framework together, and they do need to make those strong representations, which they can do with the appointment of a special envoy designated to that task.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daines. Senator Stiljohn, you have the call.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Dr. Daines, for your evidence to the committee. You mentioned in your evidence earlier on that when you returned to Australia, there was an attitude of, OK, you're home now, get on with your life. I'm wondering, in hindsight, what types of support would have been useful to yourself and to your family?
The most useful would have been a public recognition of our innocence, because that is what the case was. The Australian government gave us the support they did because they did believe wholeheartedly that we were innocent, but no declaration was made, and that had quite long-standing ramifications that exist to this day. The humiliation that my children were subjected to, of the media saying that, you know, your parents were criminals, you know, because the media lacked a certain responsibility to confirm the story. They just ran news headlines. Not once did the media get access to us because, admittedly, they were prevented access. There were no, in those days, there were no foreign journalists in Laos that were able to report openly. So I make that concession. But afterwards, you know, we should have been accorded an opportunity that our government stand up and, or even in private, just give us a document that we could use to show other organisations, like potential employers, that, oh, don't believe what you read in the media. You know, this is actually what happened. I know that opens up a whole can of worms, but...
Yes,
Sorry,
absolutely. Dr. Daines, were you ever given a explanation from the Australian government as to why they would not provide you with such a statement?
They said that they wanted to maintain a 50-year bilateral relationship with Laos. And,
yes.
Yeah, and rightly so, to be fair, because, I mean, if anyone else was detained in Laos, that you would have to have good representation there that could offer a similar support network. But on the same token, Senator, Laos got away with a lot, you know, and if Laos can, being the little country that it is, can dictate terms to a country like Australia, then one has to be a bit concerned about what message that sends to everybody else. And I always felt that Australia should have said to Laos, no, this is not right, and there will be ramifications, whether that be sanctions, which might seem extreme just for two ordinary Australians, but the principle of the matter, or whether that might be a reduction in the bilateral aid that was given to Laos at the time. There was no slap on the wrist, you know. There were no consequences. There was no accountability. And so Laos got away with it. And even today, they're not signing on to the Levinson Act, for instance. They're not upholding the principles of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights that they agreed to abide by just prior to our detainment. There has to be accountability. And I believe the person from Human Rights Watch put it quite well is that they have to look at the charter, our Human Rights Watch, human rights record rather, and make an omission in there to say, in the country charter, Laos has a history of, there has to be some acknowledgement that these rogue states that are signing on to international treaties and covenants in order to gain access to foreign aid, there has to be some acknowledgement that they're actually doing the wrong thing in other areas.
Thank you, Doctor. Could I ask as well, in addition to those broader pieces, that public recognition and those consequences, in terms of yourself and your family personally, I'm just wondering, it doesn't sound like there was any particular mental health supports offered to you or to the family, or other types of services made available to you. Is that correct?
At the time, Senator, no. It was just quite simply you're home and enjoy your freedom. And at the time, I suffered quite significantly from post-traumatic stress. I didn't really know what it was. And then it was a case of just shop around and try and find the right person, the right professional, psychologist, psychiatrist, who could give me some support. There were no debriefings, It was just a case, quite simply, you're on your own, off you go.
Yes, and I think, do you think in hindsight that, well, let me frame it a different way. We're considering as a committee what recommendations to make around how to improve this process and these experiences for people. Do you think it would be that we should consider recommending that those kind of comprehensive, trauma-informed, often very specialised forms of mental health supports and debriefing processes be offered by the Australian government to those who return from these forms of incarceration and to their families as well?
Absolutely, and I think the reason for that too is that all these unique cases need to be documented to inform a task force so that they can go in and they can work with that person, that someone like me, can go in there, do an appropriate debrief, and they can then learn lessons from that particular experience that can be documented. That would have a huge benefit to the ongoing discussion and I'm sure would be of tremendous benefit to researchers, to organisations that can tailor particular trauma counselling for those individuals. I was astounded when I came back. There was no support as such. There was support for victims of a crime in Queensland, and I was a victim of a crime, but there was no support for me.
Yes,
and I think that's lacking, Senator.
Absolutely. And you also have mentioned your experiences of challenges with the financial system as a result of this. Would you like to expand on those?
Well, how does one pay for such representation if the detaining state puts you in a state of going through an unlawful judicial process? I mean, you've got to try and prove your innocence. And in our particular case, our employer engaged a lawyer on our behalf to help formulate a book of evidence based on rumours in the media. They didn't have the facts or the allegations from the Lao government, but he worked closely with the Australian ambassadors to try and counter some of the allegations that were being fed to the media by the Laos authorities. That all costs money. We were fortunate that our employer paid that bill because it would have cost us at least $1 million. So
yes,
there's
absolutely.
there's a great consequence for these cases and an impact on the family. And a lot of social justice cases that I've worked in where, people have been detained in Vietnam and Thailand and all countries of the world, the main theme that I get from the families is that we can't afford legal representation. We can't afford the advocates, to go over when Robert Langdon was detained in Afghanistan. I was working with Stephen Kenny, a human rights lawyer, and, we had to either make a representation to the government to help fund the trip over there to try and engage with the detainee, or we had to say to the families, well, we need to do some fundraising so we can try and get some support to your loved one. And in some cases, it's we need to get some funds, we need to do some fundraising so we can make sure someone on the ground can buy food for your loved one because they're not offered those services in the detained location.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you're suggesting that in addition to the, or maybe as an auxiliary to the, or a function, I should say, of the task force, should be being able to access a legal assistance and other extraordinary expenditure requirements fund to enable the acquisition of legal representation and also to provide for the essentials of life that may not be covered by the prison system in the detaining country.
Senator, indeed, and in some instances there is a process in place that the detainee can access emergency funds. I know when I worked in the cases of the Bali Nine and Chappelle Corby, those Australians could take out an emergency loan that was payable back upon their release for medical supplies.
Was that a loan from the Australian government?
Yes.
Right, how generous of us to offer a loan. My God.
Yes. I would refer you to, I think it's on the Smart Traveller website. I haven't visited it for a while, but I think they can make a loan, they can access a loan, at least they used to be able to, and they have to pay that back. They have to give an undertaking that they would pay it back. But if you've got a 20-year sentence in Bangkok Hilton, it's a little bit difficult to make those three payments.
Well, absolutely. That shouldn't be a loan process in my view. That should be a service and support that's simply available. Look, thank you very much, Dr. Daines. I'll have to leave it there. But thank you for giving the evidence that you have to the committee. And I would really encourage you, if anything comes to you post your evidence with us today where you think, oh, I wish I had shared this piece of information or this piece of additional context, please feel free to provide it to us as a committee. We've given everyone else the deadline of the 14th of October, but I'm sure we would be willing to take additional information from you if it should occur to you between now and the reporting, the closing of the inquiry period for this inquiry.
I appreciate that, Senator, and if I could just point to one thing that I think you really do need to look at is how to deal with the situation of overturning a decision by a state that has wrongly and arbitrarily detained you.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
the ramifications are enormous.
We have heard that very loud and clear from you, Doctor, and very much that overturning would be the ideal. If you've ever had the opportunity to consider if there might be other avenues, such as an official kind of statement or addendum to a passport to make it clear Australia's view in relation to this particular conviction, or any other international examples where they've managed to successfully navigate the need to, for want of a better word, enable the convicting nation to save face in the process of hostage release while minimising the flow-on implications for the victim of the arbitrary or wrongful detention process, that would be really valuable, because I both see the need to get the person out of the detention environment as quickly as possible, and also, as you said so clearly, the real need to make sure that process of release does not mark them in such a way that hinders them and re-triggers and re-traumatises them through the course of their life.
Indeed, Senator, because every time I pass through an airport security and I have to show my passport, which has a visa in it that states that I did not qualify for the visa waiver program, it raises all those questions again, and I have to relive that trauma every time I travel.
Absolutely. It's totally unacceptable. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Steele-John. And thank you very much, Dr Daines, for appearing today and for being so forthcoming with your testimony. I know it's been really valuable to the committee to hear your story here today. And I hope that everyone listening along to the hearing at home has found it interesting as well.